Good morning, afternoon, all of you. I'm very happy to wish you welcome to this wake-up call, as we have called it, with focus on rebuilding trust and rewiring institutions in a new social contract. My name is Torres. I'm the director of Pathfinders in New York at NYU CIC. Now, let me just give you a little bit of background. The Pathfinders is a coalition of 35 countries that has basically decided to spearhead the movement to accelerate delivery of peace, justice, and inclusion. Now, a few of the participants in the panel that you are going to meet just now, they have had key roles in the Pathfinders, the Secretariat, or the Coalition. And we are in a phase right now, we all know, where we've actually had a wake-up call. The whole world, we're in the midst of a pandemic with devastating consequences for people, their lives, their health, their livelihoods. We're in the midst now of managing an emergency crisis, but we also know that there's going to be a phase coming afterwards of massive socioeconomic consequences with increasing poverty, increasing unemployment, increasing inequality, and probably also with high likelihood or risk of social unrest and violence. So we regard the situation we are in as a wake-up call. We are learning from what we are seeing around us. We see the value of social capital, we see the value of trust, and we think this is an appeal to the whole international community to basically rebuild much better with the ingredients that we have seen working. So I have with me an excellent panel. I have with me Her Excellency Dr. Priscilla Schwartz, the Attorney General and Minister of Justice from Sierra Leone. We have with us Her Excellency Ms. Allyson Maynard Gibson, former Attorney General of the Bahamas. We have with us Ms. Laura Thornton, Director of Global Programs for the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, IDEA. We have with us Ms. Rachel Locke, Director of Impact Peace. And we have the pleasure at the end of this session to have closing remarks from Her Excellency Elinor Hammarskjöld, the Director General of Political Affairs in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Sweden. Now, I think we are basically going to go straight to the panelists. We have given them all 5 minutes for the first sort of round of question. And then we have pulled in questions from social media, from the public, and we'll have follow-up questions on that basis. And I think I'd like to start with you, Allyson, if I may. You are the former Attorney General of the Bahamas, and you've also played a very active role in our justice work in the Pathfinders. You are a member of the Pathfinders Task Force on Justice. You've been part, and a crucial one, of identifying the huge challenge that we have at our hands right now. And maybe you could start with shedding some light on the importance of transparency and accountability in decision-making and responses to the pandemic. What do you think are the necessary conditions and practices for ensuring a more open justice system that can help build the necessary trust between citizens and governments in the long term? Please, Allyson, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Liv. I want to say that the pandemic, the task force believes, points to the need for more people-centered justice and more access to justice. As you know, it's done a report and made several suggestions. I'm going to discuss a few of them in the time that we have allotted. The first is to be sure that emergency measures are enforced fairly. So whenever the human rights have been suspended, transparency and accountability is even more important. So our constitutional and other higher level courts must be able to work virtually, and they must be seen to be free of political interference. Their deliberations should be made available as best possible in real time, meaning on radio, TV, even online, and their decisions rendered promptly. This increases trust in the justice system, as well as having people feel comfortable about the legality of the new measures being imposed upon them. It's also important to involve community leaders in reaching the most vulnerable in communities to ensure that they have food, water, their medication, and other essentials. Wherever there are sanctions, they should be used with restraint, and every attempt should be made to avoid harassing vulnerable communities. People need to be protected from violence, and most especially domestic violence, which is increasing during this pandemic. So persons involved in this area should be seen to be essential workers, and the places from which they work should remain open and perhaps even enhanced during lockdown. We also want to see partnerships with entities that may be seen to be unusual, like, for example, the justice system with social workers and with the education system, teachers. This way, we'll be able to identify children that are vulnerable in these circumstances. It's also important to make people partners in the whole thrust. For example, if community leaders are involved, they can share health and other information. They can ensure that those most in need get their treatment. They can identify any abuse by security systems, and they can help those who need it to access housing, employment, other social services, and other benefits. Accountability mechanisms that are independent are also important, like an ombudsman, like supporting civil rights and human rights NGOs, and of course, where applicable, parliamentary committees that also have accountability mechanisms. It's also important for the government to establish mechanisms to get direct feedback from citizens, for example, using social media or even representative citizen committees. It's important to reduce the demand on the justice system. Ministries of justice around the world, if they are not already, should be triaging to determine what's critical, what's urgent, and what's not a priority. For example, countries are releasing low-risk prisoners. They're ensuring that correctional facilities are not hotbeds for the COVID virus. And whenever there are arrests, they are making sure that they don't incur neither arrest nor prosecutions for minor offenses. And wherever trials do go ahead, non-custodial sentences should be used sparingly. Triage is also necessary for civil cases. For example, a domestic violence matter is of necessity urgent, but a divorce or a custody matter or a matter only involving economic considerations is not urgent. We want to utilize more online and mediation services and helplines. This will be enhanced if proper partnerships or good partnerships are established with telephone companies, online service providers, etc., so that people can have important access to these services. And it's important after the pandemic to use the virtual courts to deal with the backlogs that will be ensuing during the pandemic. We'd like also to see increase in innovation and smart working. For example, let's move away from the predominant lawyer court-based way of dealing with things and move to alternative dispute resolution, including utility of using online mediation and other alternative dispute mechanisms, like I said. And note that not only will this increase efficiency, but in some communities, this actually enhances safety also, avoiding face-to-face contact with persons who are in disputes. And we should note that in many of these countries, only a modest amount of funding is necessary to actually enable this service to be provided. So we really would like to see people focus on this opportunity.
Thank you very much. Now, it's very clear for me that you have got a very good vision of the aims that you want us and the international community to achieve. But how do you see that this is going to work in practice? How can we restore this interaction between state and communities that we see in some places have broken down? And what is the role of the justice system in that respect?
I think that we can learn a lot at this time from health scientists who, through their collaboration on national and international levels, have been able to cause national governments to actually respond rapidly to the situations, right? So it'll be important to identify and support innovative models to provide legal aid, virtual justice systems, and especially those who work on open source platforms. Let's support those. Let's also support under-resourced justice systems and make sure that we remove unnecessary bureaucracy. I don't want to go as far as saying that all bureaucracy is unnecessary, but let's remove unnecessary bureaucracy. And let's also build, as the health sector workers have done, a virtual forum where justice leaders can speak frequently to each other and exchange ideas and best practices. We think this is very, very important. The pandemic, as you said, Liv, is a growing source of injustice, and our response to it can move towards promoting more just societies. So this really is a wake-up call to build capacity to deal with the wave of challenges that are going to be coming because people are losing their jobs, they're trying to keep their families together, they're trying to remain in their homes, and they're trying to stay on their land. We should recommit to justice and equity to give redress for persons who've been victims of discrimination and human rights violations. And I don't think I can say it better than the Secretary General has said, and that is that we will recover better if we have inclusive and sustainable models of development. Nothing better than that.
Thank you very, very much. And thanks for all the great work that you are doing. Indeed, a justice champion and a champion for change and a wake-up call. I'm sure that you have all noticed that you got a full women's panel, which is quite interesting, I think. I'm not going to say anything more about that. Just leave it for the rest of you out there in the big world to think about it. But we are also now sitting in each our countries. And I'm going to... I should first mention that we will be joined in a little while by Minister Schwartz, but in the meantime, we are going to first listen to Laura Thornton, who is sitting actually in the country of Georgia right now, trying to get to Sweden at some stage. We are doing work for Inshallah. You have taken over in IDEA, and I'd like to ask you in particular about this bond between citizens and the state, because we know how crucial it is. We've seen how important it is in those countries that have actually managed to deal relatively successfully with the crisis. So the question, I guess, to you is, what have we learned from this crisis in terms of this bond between citizens and the state, citizens and their government. What are the critical pillars of such bonds, and what can we learn from the bond breaking, so to speak? Please, Laura.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Liv. And first, on behalf of International IDEA, we're just delighted for being part of this esteemed event, and I'm honored to be on this panel. I do think a critical result of this horrible crisis is not only on its impact on the relationships between citizens and state, but what it's revealed about the quality of this relationship prior to the crisis. First, there's this issue of democracy delivering. Unfortunately, we've seen this erosion in the social contract between citizens and state, even in the most established democracy. From my current home in Tbilisi to my home of birth in the United States, people are both furious and despondent. They're electing governments that fail to deliver equitable, inclusive growth. Politicians are viewed as corrupted by economic elites. The divide between the rich and the poor keep growing. Many become hopeless and apathetic. Others turn to the siren calls of far-right nationalist movements that peddle in intolerance and tribalism. So the pandemic in some ways just brought these failures and inequities sort of bubbling to the surface. The lack of social safety nets, the fact that enormous percentages of our populations live paycheck to paycheck or day to day with no savings. Dysfunctional healthcare systems that create uneven pre-existing health conditions in different populations. People say the pandemic affects everybody equally, but the very concept of shelter in place is a privilege. Second, with regard to this relationship between state and citizens, I think is just the issue of basic effective governance and state capacity. Initially, folks tried to define this as a democracy, non-democracy dichotomy. I hope that's dying away, with the argument that democracies are hindered by checks and balances and rights. However, it's evident that the successful responses were about competent government and leadership, organizing quickly, believing scientists, putting systems in place to test and trace, providing regular, accurate information, having a clear plan articulated from the top. This happened in democracies and, yes, some hybrid democracies. However, democracies were better equipped on another critical factor: oversight, legislative, judicial, media, to prevent executive abuse. And what I think is interesting is where the state has been weak or inept and governance has failed to some degree, we've also seen these informal power structures step in. We've heard about in favelas, gangs monitoring social distancing, or in other countries, drug lords and terrorist organizations delivering food. So we've kind of seen where power and authority can lie at different levels of society. In Georgia, the country where I live, the state was actually quite swift and comprehensive in its response, but it couldn't stand up to the Orthodox Church, who continued to host worshipers and have them drink communion from the same spoon. So the third point in this relationship, which is at the crux of your question, is this issue of trust in state, trust in society. It's the subtext of all of this. I think it's emerged in really interesting ways. You take the case of China, where initially the lack of transparency and information not only exacerbated the crisis, but also infuriated Chinese public. Social media was abuzz with anger and real honest distrust in the state. And it'll be interesting to see whether that's here to stay, whether the Chinese public will continue to demand transparency and information. And then on the other side, you have the South Korean elections. I think a great example of trust, where the country actually held an election because they had rigorous preparation and safety measures, transparency in regarding providing information, a competent National Election Commission. But mostly people just had faith their government institutions were acting in their best interests. You compare that to the elections that took place in Wisconsin, when the entire concept of holding the election was shadowed with distrust in the state, distrust between parties. And the actual conduct was frankly quite disgraceful, and has further sort of eroded trust in particularly a very polarized environment. So I do hope, sort of as you've stated, that this presents an opportunity, a wake-up call, not to go back to the way things were with regard to this state-citizen social contract, but to rethink, recalibrate, strengthen our governance structures, ensure that democracy delivers by being inclusive, institutions are agile to respond to citizens' needs and are transparent, and limiting the role of money in politics. And hopefully through more responsive institutions, then states can slowly rebuild the public trust.
Now, thank you very much, Laura. You give a very accurate and good picture, I think, of the situation and also the challenges. But that brings us then to the follow-up question of what can be done in order to strengthen this bond and strengthen the trust and the social capital. What can be done by the multilateral system and community? And I'm tempted to throw in an extra question as to why do you think leaders don't invest in this trust building and social capital when that, after all, is much cheaper than a lot of other bigger measures? Please.
That's an excellent question. Well, first, on the multilateral issue, I mean, I think this crisis, if anything, has revealed the catastrophic cost of isolationism and weak global cooperation. I think with Brexit, with Trump's vocal disdain for international organizations and order, we've seen a weakening of our global democratic ecosystem over the past few years. And in my view, nationalism is the biggest threat going forward. A pandemic and whatever the next crisis will be, health, climate change, something else, it's global. It requires global response. I think a lot has been described about, obviously the health and economic consequences, but there's a governance crisis at the same time. And as I mentioned in my first response, it's critical not to neglect that. And global commitment is really needed to support these efforts at enhancing democratic institutions. And it'll involve tracking and monitoring the relationship between the pandemic and democratic governance moving forward. But importantly, how do we draw lessons from this to arm against future crises? So some of the concrete areas, one is obviously the use of emergency powers. I'm not at all suggesting that these are undemocratic inherently. They're not. They're a sign that democracy is working. The question is, are they unnecessary? Are there restrictions on speech? Are they purely self-interested abuses like Viktor Orban trampling on the rights of the LGBTI community? It's important that they have oversight. And related, I think another thing that we need to look at the use of digital surveillance and if it's being used for purposes other than those required by the immediate crisis. And I think we need to be vocal and denounce and sanction both political and non-state actors who are abusing this situation to push authoritarian agendas or target political opponents or ethnic and religious minorities, which we have seen, unfortunately. I think we also need to be creative to commit and help each other support democratic practices. How does democracy work 6 feet apart? How do candidates and parties campaign? How do MPs talk to constituents? How do activist groups mobilize around causes? What innovations can we be sharing with one another? And then sort of to your last question, I think it's a longer term issue. How can we work as a global community to invest in greater state capacity? An economic recovery is not going to happen without impartial, effective, transparent administration that is responsive to citizens' needs and is protecting basic welfare and rights. How do we support representative legislatures, democratic, inclusive parties, and credible election processes? How do we involve civil society and protect space for citizens' engagement and marginalized communities? And of course, oversight, judicial independence, protection of information and media freedom. The list goes on. But I do think it all comes back to the collective we. We as an international community, IDEA as an intergovernmental organization, how can we work together to support countries that are struggling to make these improvements going forward?
Now, Thank you very much. That was very informative, Laura. And I think that hands the whole challenging picture, Rachel, very nicely over to you, because now Allyson has outlined the broad set of ambitions and goals and visions and values we should strive for. You, Laura, have outlined what is actually happening on the ground in many countries, and the problems we have in achieving the goals outlined, and exactly that social capital and trust and bonds that we want to have developed. Now, Rachel, you have done a lot of work over the years on violence, the situation on the ground. Is it possible for you to say a little bit about how the pandemic has affected police and community relationships, as well as violence on the ground? What is actually the effect of this, of the pandemic, but also the breakdown of trust and good communication and the good bonds that we heard outlined before? What is the effects of that, and how can community organizations rebuild from below, basically? Please go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And also honored to be part of this very powerful all-female panel. So thank you for the opportunity. So let's start, I think, with a big picture point, which is that we have evidence from cities around the world that there's a very clear relationship between low levels of trust between police and community and high levels of violence. So where trust and legitimacy are low, we tend to see violence be higher. Where trust is high, we tend to see violence be lower. And the reasons for this finding are numerous, but they do include the way in which police and other security actors provide protection for and maintain a certain elite power imbalance, very often at the expense of those who are excluded from economic and political power. And also, it's true to say that typically these perceptions are not solely a feature of today's tactic, but have been forged over decades of overly repressive and arbitrary use of force against particular communities. So what we're seeing with COVID is, rather than fostering or creating entirely new dynamics, rather it's exacerbating existing disparities. So that's true if you're a daily wage earner and you're now put in higher risk for food security. It's also true with issues of police-community relationships. And we've seen various examples of police doubling down on sort of overly harsh or repressive tactics. So in the first 2 weeks of the lockdown order in Kenya, for example, at least 12 people were killed by the police enforcing curfews and other restrictions. In the Philippines, we saw President Duterte order a shoot to kill against troublemakers, which gave permission to use deadly force. This, of course, is a feature of his administration since the beginning. And in New York City, which was my home, we saw disparities between those who were able to remain at home or, frankly, to go sun themselves in Central Park, and those who were forced to use public transit, putting themselves not only at risk of the virus, but also harsh enforcement of some of the restrictions by the New York City Police Department. So across the US, we're seeing lower income people of color dying at much higher rates as a result of the virus than their overall city population would warrant. So the disparities in how people are treated by and therefore perceive their public sector institutions mirror these social inequalities that are pre-existing, whether those are racial, economic, geographic, gendered, or otherwise, and very often a combination thereof. And in all too many cases, these disparities are not improving. For many measures, they're getting worse, right? So cities today are 75% of the world's cities today are less equal in terms of income inequality than they were just 2 decades ago. And just as place-based disparities are impacting who is most at risk of the virus, so are place-based disparities influencing risk to violence and other comorbidities. So in Chicago, for example, a difference of 8 miles can mean a difference of 30 years of life expectancy. So that's a massive place-based disparity that is putting people at risk. So the point about what can be done and grassroots and organizations, huge amount of work is being done right now by individuals and organizations. And we've seen examples from Chicago to Sao Paulo to Cape Town of people and groups stepping up to provide services to those in need and also serving as communications bridges where people are skeptical of the communication coming from their formal government system. We should be talking more about these examples. They're heartwarming. I also think it's unrealistic and somewhat unfair to ask individuals to take on the work of a functioning government. Further, in the face of the rising inequality and authoritarianism, some of which Laura spoke to, I think it's unrealistic for us to hope that the altruism of mutual aid societies will be fully sufficient to sort of withstand the forces of those who we see organized to maintain elite power structures. So I have some further examples of what some cities are doing, if you want me to keep going.
Yes, please. And can I just jump in on that, Rachel? I also think Minister Schwartz has got technical problems, so we may have a bit more time. But please give us some more examples. And if you can add also a little bit about information about community organizing, because in my head, it's like 2-3 different kinds of community organizing. It's the one type of organizing where community jumps in to do health tasks, education, basically jumps in, like you said, to do the job of a government, or that many of us would see is the job of a government. But there's another set of civil society tasks and organizing as well, which is about organizing interests, raising demands, pushing forward an agenda, building a base for demanding a political change or a social contract. So can you say a little bit also about what is happening on the ground in terms of responding?
Sure. So I think what we're seeing, and there have been several articles put out about this that are fascinating, is a transfer of the protest movements that were taking place in 2019, of which there were many, advocating for and articulating messages of more inclusive, more equal government systems and policies, a transfer of those from the streets, from the in-person space, to online space, to banging on pots and pans outside of people's windows, as we've seen in Brazil and other places, to still being in the street but organized, right? So people standing 6 feet apart from one another. So there's been a real transference of that, the power of and the integrity of those protest movements and those calls for more inclusive governance, adapting to the current situation in such a way that maintains a focus on the agenda and also maintains public safety and public health. So we've seen quite a bit of action there. And again, I think it's worth it to be highlighting those movements more, so that the protest movements of 2019, which were so important to push back against some of the increasing authoritarianism that we're seeing globally, that those maintain the sort of fuel and energy that they need. And here again, I think we see cities and the power of cities being really important. So what we say is very often is that cities are places where innovation and demand for action come together. So cities are inherently practical spaces. People who lead cities must get things done, right? So what we're seeing in many of the cities that I work with and work with together with Pathfinders and Plus Peace through the Peace in Our Cities network is city authorities working together with civil society to both provide life-saving services to communities who otherwise are left behind. So hand sanitizer, food, other essentials, but also to serve as bridges of communication between those individuals and higher national government authorities who may not be placing those individuals in priority. So Palmyra, Colombia is one example of this, where the city is serving as a bridge between the local and the national, in particular with regard to policing, which is nationalized in Colombia. It's not city police. But they're also providing wraparound services for people at high risk. In Oakland, California, we're seeing the city actively and explicitly recognize the work being done by violence interrupters. So these are individuals who typically work to stop retaliatory cycles of violence, but are now providing these essential services and communications to people who lack trust in formal government structures. The city is actively supporting these individuals and engaging with them in such a way that helps to spread messages that are inherently life-saving and at a time of a global pandemic.
Now, thank you very much. We are still struggling to get Minister Schwartz on from Sierra Leone. She's having technical problems, so she still has another 10 minutes to go if she's managing to get on. But I would like to use this extra bit of time to actually take a second round, because I think we all see in the panel here that investments in equality, justice, inclusion, peace are exactly those investments that need to be made now and in the recovery phase after this wake-up call, in order to create that trust and social contract that is both going to make us better able to deal with the recovery phase, well, the emergency in itself for those countries that are still in the worst phase, but also the recovery phase, and make us better able to deal with the next pandemic, because we're going to have a new crisis coming up. They're probably going to look different or slightly different from this one. Crises tend to be different every time they come. But we do know that trust and social capital is a good pillar of preparedness for any crisis and any emergency. So the question, I guess, is the following. We know we need the trust, we need the social contract. We also know that we need to work both on the multilateral system, the national, and in civil society. Now, I've seen a lot of the most fantastic civil society, and that's where I want to focus now. I was part of an anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. I've followed civil society work and organizations for many years. But I also know that there are parts of civil society that is not civil, let me put it like this, and that are now organizing in order to break down that social trust that we are talking about. So I guess the question to all of you is, can you reflect a little bit upon around how to build a stronger civil society movement of constructive optimism and peace, equality, and justice? How can we organize a broader movement for that wake-up call among ordinary people?
Mm-hmm.
and the strong organizations, also to mention. Allyson, do you want to you are a massively important justice champion, so your role model is important in itself. But what are you saying to people when you meet ordinary people? How can we appeal to everyone, for everyone to understand that this is a wake-up call for all of us? We can't point only to others. We have to all get engaged in this. Allyson, please.
Thank you. That's a great question, Olive. I think that the pandemic points out very, very clearly to everybody that this is not something, the virus doesn't touch one group and not another. Everybody is impacted. Everybody in every community, everybody in every country, everybody across the world. And so this is not the opportunity for an isolationist approach, whether it's at the community level or whether it's at an international level. And so I think that just as in families, that we find ways to, the word tolerate is coming to mind, the viewpoints of others. And we find ways and we leave room for others, family members, to express themselves, yet still be a part of and embraced by the family. We have to take that same approach to the community level and also then to the country level and then also to the international level. It sounds simplistic, but I really want to go back to the reality that everybody is feeling today. And that is that I'm sheltering in place, but really my security is only as strong as the weakest link. And so therefore we have to find ways to pursue justice in its purest sense. And to do that, we have to make sure that that we are people-centered, that everybody feels that they have access to everything that is being provided, and that everybody feels that they are being heard and they are a part of a community. I think that's really important. And the pandemic is teaching us that.
That was a very, very wise input. We are only as strong as the weakest link. Laura?
Yes, thanks. Wonderful comment. I've been thinking a lot about this, particularly when you bring up the concept of uncivil movements. We've seen here in the Caucasus, in particular, we've seen a rise of civil society. They're, people's groups that come together to spew hatred, spread disinformation, mobilize against minorities. And these are very, very dangerous forces. So you're raising, I think, Liv, an important question. So how do we inoculate ourselves? Because we are part of the problem, and we need to somehow develop within ourselves a sense of resilience. And I agree completely that this is partly at the family level, but I wonder how much more, needs to be done at the community level to sort of build trust within communities and have a social contract within communities. So when I was talking before about trust between people and state, it's also trust within societies. And one of the projects I worked for some time on here in Georgia is what we call the Resilience Project. And it's the long haul. It's looking at things like civic education in school. It's looking at things like sports clubs and Girl Scouts. And how do we build community libraries, civic centers? How can we create space where people can have more trust with one another, engage with one another, build up a sense of social capital within the community? And that, I think, makes them more, resilient to crisis and bounce back more quickly and more resistant to malign forces and disinformation. And I don't want to talk too long, but I do believe in the information integrity is one of our biggest challenges going forward. And the pandemic brought that very clearly to light. And we have a serious problem to address. And we are never going to be able to stop it on social media. It's like squeezing a water balloon. It will come out somewhere else. So we need to be consumers of information. And that is a long journey. And we have to invest at a person-to-person level.
Thank you. Rachel?
So, unsurprisingly, perhaps I agree completely with both all of the comments just made, particularly being people-centered, making sure that people have access not only to life-saving material and products, but also access to safe and just communities and societies within which to live today and in the long term, and also that people's voices are listened to. Just want to sort of reinforce and highlight 2 points here. One is that it's worth acknowledging that right now is a time of heightened and increased attacks against journalists and civil society actors, and human rights defenders, environmental defenders, increasing numbers of individuals being attacked for raising their voices, right? So ensuring the levels of protection are in place for those individuals for whom we are seeking their voices to be louder, to be stronger, to be heard. That's a core function for those of us, I think, in the international community. And we need to take that much more seriously in light of the risks that people are taking on. And the second point is to sort of double down on this point about misinformation and conspiracy theories and not be sort of complicit in how deeply people are being taken in by them, and how very strongly people believe what they're hearing and what they're being told through some of these conspiracy websites, but also networks, right? Informal, just social networks that people belong to where misinformation is spreading. And this in a context, of course, of sweeping polarization globally. So the forces of misinformation are organized, right? And we need to be very clear about that. And just as they are organized to use misinformation for particular political gains, so must we recognize that, shine light on that, and be very smart about it. So rather than increasing polarization and antagonism between individuals at the community level, that we're taking that dialogue, that fight, if you will, although I hate to use that word, to the people who are organizing the misinformation campaigns. They're the ones that are trying to divide us, and really trying to resist that and maintain the resilience at the local and community level, I think is important.
You know, you remind me of this quote to Martin Luther King, who said that those who love peace need to get as good at organizing as those that love war. And I think that's basically it. Now, Elinor Hammarskjöld, we're going to turn to you in a second with a big apology that we've not been able to link Priscilla Schwartz up, the Minister of Justice and Attorney General from Sierra Leone. She's basically struggling with technical problems, so we are very sorry about that. Now, we also know that Sierra Leone both has its challenges with the pandemic, as we all have. But the Minister Schwartz has also been for long stalwart champion of justice as well, in the same company as Allyson, and active in the task force and the justice work of Pathfinders. So we are looking forward to getting her back on another occasion. Now, Elinor Hammarskjöld, we are not giving you an easy challenge, trying to sort of come with some concluding comments after these huge topics that we've had on the agenda. But I'm now leaving it to you, Director General of Political Affairs, Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Sweden. Please, Elinor.
Thank you so much, Liv, and thank you to all the fantastic members of this panel. I think it's a discussion we could have carried on for many more hours. I think I want to start and end at the global level, but then touch on some of the different themes that I will certainly take with me from this really important discussion. I think as a point of departure, looking at where we are today, to say that obviously the world has no deficit of challenges, and the pandemic that we're facing now is one of them, but we need not to lose sight of the other critical challenges that we were focusing on not that many months ago, and that are still crucial, be they inequality or conflict or climate change, and that following on from that, the need for multilateral cooperation and a rules-based international order is as important as ever, although the challenges may be more difficult today and taking new forms. I think picking up on the discussion in the panel, it's clear that we face a number of issues related to how the international system as a whole and national governance is able to deliver to citizens, deliver to societies, and deliver to the international community. And one thing that several of you have touched upon, of course, is how important it is for just and democratic societies to find conditions for everyone to participate and influence public decision making. I think there will be a lot of questions related to our capacity and our ability to deliver during the course of this current crisis, and in the follow-up to it, a lot of issues to look at as to what were the main difficulties, and you touched on a number of them. Following on from that, of course, it's a question, how do we maintain and improve the social contracts that are so much part of our ability to deliver sustainable development, to deliver democracy? I think, as Laura Thornton said, there's a lot also in how we're dealing with the current crisis that we should be looking at already as ways to learn for future crises, be they pandemics or other ones. As several of you mentioned, of course, we are seeing a backtracking of the achievements we've made in the field of democracy. There are certainly authoritarian actors who are trying to take advantage of the current situation to advance their agendas, undermining democratic institutions, violating human rights. And as Allyson, Maynard, Gibson said, there is an important dimension for us to remember, which is that the emergency measures and restrictions that are being imposed to human rights in this situation have to be strictly in line with our obligations under national legislation, but also international law. And that one of the things we need to keep on our radar as we begin to exit this crisis is that those restrictions are also retracted, and that we don't shift the normative basis that we have as states accepted in a negative direction. As many of you know, Sweden launched a drive for democracy as a way of responding to a concern that we had way before the pandemic of the negative trends that we could see in democracy. And what we've been trying to do is to focus on the building blocks of democracy, and how can we as Sweden, through our foreign service, through the instruments at our disposal, work on strengthening civil society, work on improving respect for human rights, freedom of the media, democratic participation, not least, as several of you have highlighted, of women and young persons, and to try and bring back a discussion about, from the local level to the international and everything in between, what works and what do we risk losing. One dimension that is very worrying to us during the COVID-19 pandemic are the serious implications for gender equality, and you've touched on that, both in terms of the enjoyment of human rights for women and girls, the increase in gender-based violence, the negative consequences for sexual and reproductive health and rights, and here is also a dimension of the consequences of closure, the consequences of the narrowing of some of the space for human rights. And there, I think we have a real issue looking ahead as we exit the pandemic. How do we address the violations that have taken place and the new challenges that many societies will have faced in these areas? What we need to do here and now, of course, is to secure and ensure that our response to the pandemic is development efforts we're doing, whether it's legislation that we're putting in place. Several of the panelists also touched on the linkage between local crises and how easily local crises can become global, and that we're all affected. And that is also means that those who were already vulnerable at the outset are at risk of being increasingly vulnerable now and ahead. And so, again, that requires of us, and I thought that you, Rachel Locke, you pointed to a number of ways in which the local and the governance levels are interlinked. Part of that is, of course, of seeing those links and identifying them, and being able also to see communities as actors as we look ahead. We have all spent a lot of time looking at how to implement the 2030 agenda and the SDGs. And there, the dialogue that we have now on how to continue to implement the SDGs, how to push that agenda ahead, and not to lose momentum as a result of the pandemic is one key aspect. And that comes then I come back to the issue of trust that has sort of permeated our discussion. That trust in that kind of agenda also is about including those groups and those individuals who are so often left out of the conversation. So to round off, I'd come back to the UN, and which is turning 75 this year. And I think what we have now is a 75th anniversary where the conversation really has to be one which really puts people at the center, where the lessons that we're learning throughout COVID-19 come to play in how we formulate the view ahead for the UN, of course. I'm proud that Sweden's ambassador is one of the two ambassadors together with Qatar who are facilitating the declaration for September. But rallying around an international agenda based on human rights, democracy, and accountability will be a crucial part of that. So I'll end there by thanking you all for a great discussion, which we could have continued, as I say, for a long time. Thanks.
Thank you all to everyone who has joined us, but first and foremost, the panelists, and to you, Elinor, for closing it off for us. I think we all agree that social trust is critical. I think we also all agree here in this panel, there wasn't much disagreement, actually. I think we all also agreed that social capital is a more viable and sustainable path forward, and a better investment, much cheaper and much more efficient, and creating more resilience in the long term than many other options. So social trust, social capital of crucial value when we go forward. And that is an appeal to all of us. We have to work for that on all levels. And with Allyson's quote, to close off, we are only as strong as the weakest link. I thank you all for joining in, and in particular to the panelists, to the CIPRI conference, and to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Sweden. Thank you. Have a nice day.